does dairy consumption associate with higher risk of heart disease? That's a very important question for people who advocate plant-based diets and veganism and so on to consider, because when you actually look, the hypothesis, the lipid heart hypothesis, presupposes that saturated fat raises cholesterol. There's no evidence for that, by the way. And that therefore it causes heart disease. So if we find data sets where this doesn't correlate, that pretty much nips the lipid heart hypothesis right in the bud. Let's look at this. This is from a video called, a video by Plant-Based News, I believe, called What Happens to Your Heart When You Consume Dairy. Let's see what they have to say.
What if I told you the glass of milk sitting in your fridge right now could be silently killing you? Well, the truth is,
I would say you're an idiot, because humans have been drinking milk for thousands of years and we're still here, right? Some humans, not all.
dairy isn't just unnecessary, it's actively damaging the most important muscle in your body.
So again, where is the evidence for that? We need to, whenever someone makes a positive claim like that, you know, it's good to have a claim that's falsifiable. So in this video, if we can find data sets, and I think we will find data sets that disprove this, those data sets are much more powerful because they're disproving a hypothesis than whatever data set he wants to find that is supporting his hypothesis. So the example I always like to give is the example of flightless birds, right? So if I have a hypothesis, all birds fly, you can test that and you can find 100 different birds that fly. That doesn't prove the hypothesis is true. Once I look around and I find an ostrich or an emu or a penguin, I have disproved the hypothesis. So one piece of negative evidence is far more important than thousands and millions of birds that fly, millions of pieces of positive evidence, right? So we always want to be trying to disprove our hypothesis if we're doing good science.
Body, your heart. So in this video, I'm going to reveal the shocking science linking dairy to heart disease that the multi-billion-dollar dairy industry doesn't want you to know. How
So the fact that, the fact that food, in our capitalist system is also capitalist, like it's not really that relevant, right? We're dealing with a very specific piece of this. If we don't like capitalism, we don't like certain things about the economy and so on, that's not that relevant, right? Because every company tries to promote its products. That's just how the system within which we are working, that's how it, with the system within which we're living, that's how that system works.
regular dairy consumption, especially cheese, can contribute significantly to clogged arteries and
Why cheese particularly? I mean, is he going to talk about casein? Is he going to talk about salt? Like, why cheese?
increased heart disease risk over time. I'll share the 5 plant-based alternatives that don't just replace dairy, they support having a stronger cardiovascular system.
Well, again, if you're making positive statements, that's the burden of proof is on you. You need a very, very good trial to prove that something like a highly processed food like oat milk, you need like a lot of data to indicate that that's true. And you need to make a good faith attempt to disprove your hypothesis. And without seeing this video, I can pretty much guarantee you that no one's made that good faith attempt.
If we haven't met yet, I'm Jason Roel, Plant.
I could care about less. I'm going to forward this stuff. Okay.
So, have you ever wondered why humans are the only species on the planet that drink milk after infancy and from an entirely different animal?
We are kind of, but kind of not, right? So there are many cases, there are weird cases you can find of birds trying to steal milk from mothers and so on. So it's a good question, but there is a logical answer to that. And from my perspective as an anthropologist, when the megafauna went extinct, humans lost their main source of dietary fat, which was the fat of these huge animals, like we're talking 2 or 3 times the size of modern elephants, and that were very, very fatty, and humans evolved to eat fat. So when we lost that, people adopted different strategies. Some cultures adopted carbohydrate consumption as a strategy. Some cultures adopted, it couldn't be protein consumption. There's limits on how much protein one can consume. So either you consume more carbs or more fats. And one way to get more fats into your body was through through sort of raising animals specifically for their dairy, including cows and camels and so on. So it was a survival strategy, in my opinion, based on the current evidence. The alternative would have been for those populations to go extinct, right? So are you saying that humans should have gone extinct at the end of the last ice age? Like, what are you saying here?
Just think about it. If dairy were truly essential for our health, wouldn't nature have made it?
So there are lots of foods that aren't essential, but are actually healthy. In fact, I'd say there's almost no food that's essential in the way that he wants to say that. I'm trying to think. Is there a food that's actually like essential? Listen, I'm a very like pro meat and pro, carnivore kind of a person, but even I wouldn't say that those foods are essential. We have people, for example, with alpha-gal syndrome or tick bites or other kinds of allergies who can't take meat, who can't take dairy, and we still find ways to help them improve, right? So essential is not like, who cares if it's not essential? You can create adequate diets on almost anything. So what?
A requirement for all mammals throughout their lives. So let me show you exactly how dairy damages your heart in real time. Imagine.
So, I mean, I can answer the question of that. It does not. It absolutely does not, except there is something in some kinds of dairy called lactose, which is a sugar. Now, sugar damages the heart, damages the arteries in real time. There's no question about that, right? So other than that, no, it doesn't.
Your arteries as busy highways. Dairy's saturated fat acts like a 50-car pileup during rush hour, clogging.
That is complete nonsense. What is this? What is this? This is no. There's no basis for that statement, right? Zero. Yeah. What are you even talking about, right? So when you consume anything, when you consume a fat, when you consume protein, it gets digested, it gets broken down into different things. The way they're transported around our cells is in triglycerides, if we're talking about fat, right? That's three glycerol molecules being transported together, and the different kinds of transport cells, but mostly we're talking about lipoproteins, right? The same LDL, low density lipoprotein, HDL, high density lipoprotein, etc. That's how the fat gets trafficked. And those of us like myself who rely on fat for fuel, we actually, there's correlational studies showing that we have a lesser chance of heart attacks. Now, I don't want to say these things are not guaranteed, but it is true that sugar actually glycates. Sugar damages the arteries, and patching up that damage is what causes the plaquing. Saturated fat doesn't get stuck. That's complete nonsense. Like, this is the old drain pipe analogy. That doesn't make any sense at all. Even good lipidologists, who I disagree with, but people who are actually scientists, would say that this is a stupid picture. This is not what's happening. Now, they may claim that in cholesterol in certain situations damages the arterial wall or penetrates the arterial wall and builds up plaque, which I don't agree with that either. Well, I do agree with it in certain situations it might happen, but often what's happening is that the cholesterol is going in and the plaques are coming in, basically as scar tissue, because damage has been done by sugar, by cigarettes, by pollution, by other things, by lack of light. There are lots of things that can cause damage, and then the cholesterol is going in to patch it up. Saturated fat is not part of this story. Like, it's just not. I don't understand what he's trying to say here.
Lanes, creating congestion, and making.
Again, I should clarify. Saturated fat, even according to Dr. Dayspring and people who believe the lipid heart hypothesis and so on, this is not the story of saturated fat. They believe that saturated fat increases cholesterol, which then compromises, and somehow cholesterol particles can violate the integrity of the arterial wall and get behind there, and that's what causes the plaque. That's what they believe, not this, whatever this is.
Nearly impossible for blood to flow efficiently. So the more dairy that you consume, the worse this traffic jam becomes, until eventually nothing moves at all.
That's complete nonsense. Complete nonsense.
That's when heart attacks happen.
So again, oh man, there's so many counterexamples to this. I don't even know where to begin. But if you look at a recent famous fruitarian called Mango Wozniak, I think, who died of multiple heart attacks, basically of his arteries being clogged. This is according to his own partner and videos that she's made. He hadn't consumed any dairy since 1990 something, 1992 or something crazy like that. And he was riddled with heart disease, according to his own partner, right? So is it dairy that's causing the heart attacks, or is it the sugar?
Here's what's shocking. Dairy is the #1 source of artery clogging saturated fat in the.
So if you remove the words artery clogging, then suddenly that becomes a true statement. So in the diet, there's this tendency on the vegan websites and vegan videos and so on to demonize animal foods like beef and so on, and to call it saturated fat. Beef, I think it's close. Like beef fat is 49% saturated and 51% mostly MUFA, monounsaturated fats, but it has other fats in there too. Basically, all the fat sources have many different kinds of fat, including olive oil. By the way, olive oil is, depending on what olive oil you get, maybe 20% saturated fat, at least 13%, I believe. So are you saying that olive oil is also unhealthy because it's a pretty significant source of saturated fat? No, they just want to go after dairy because dairy is the only thing that's more than 50% saturated fat. I think there's some animal fats that are close to 50, but dairy, depending on the source, 60, 70% saturated fat could be. By the way, why do we care about this from my perspective? Because saturated fats tend to be stable at room temperature, right? They're less likely to oxidize. And therefore, if we're talking about fats that, and from my perspective as an anthropologist, they're a historically reliable source of fat. In other words, we were eating foods that were fairly high in saturated fat, like that beef fat that I mentioned a while ago, for thousands, maybe millions, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of years, right? So ancestrally speaking, that's the safe stuff. The new stuff, including, by the way, olive oil that's heavy in PUFAs, polyunsaturated fatty acids, those can oxidize very quickly, especially given our modern food environments, foods being left, shelf-stable foods being left out for many, many weeks, months, years. There's other polyunsaturated fats that are actually oxidized before you buy them. Those are the highly refined seed oils, etc. So anyway, from my perspective, if someone has a choice between saturated fat and mostly, unsaturated fats, we would actually want to shift them towards the saturated fat because that's what we know prima facie to be the healthier source of fat, right?
The American diet. A single slice of cheddar cheese contains 6 grams of saturated fat. That's nearly a third.
Not relevant, right? So, really not relevant.
Third of your daily limit. And
the daily limits are set by people who don't understand these scientific principles, right? And they're set as part of political processes. And often they're set trying to keep in mind how much of a nutrient we need to avoid deficiencies, right? So not helpful, any of this.
American eats over 40 pounds of cheese every year.
Sounds like a big amount, but when you divide 40 pounds by 365 days, you find out that it's not really that much, right? Maybe they should be eating 80 pounds or 120 pounds, right? So these big numbers are just meant to, I don't know who the vegans think they're talking to. Do we have the intellectual capacity of like a 6-year-old? This is not, these are not meaningful statistics.
Here. Now, even more alarming, most dairy products contain naturally occurring trans fats. These are the same dangerous compounds that have been banned in processed foods because they're so destructive to heart health.
And there's no evidence that trans fats in dairy are harmful, or in meat, or anywhere else, right? There is evidence that trans fats in industrialized refined seed oils and margarines are harmful. There's lots of evidence for that, incredible amounts of evidence for that. You can read, what's a good book for that one? Nina Teicholz's Big Fat Surprise. That's a good one. Many sources where you can find evidence that trans fats are not healthy.
Did you know that a 2018 study in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition found that replacing dairy fat with plant-based fats reduces heart disease risk by 24%? And
so let's take a look at that, because those numbers, maybe, and is it relevant is a question. So again, the thing to remember when you're looking at these plant-based, whatever this guy is, I don't even know if he's a doctor, when they cite studies, you actually want to bring up the study. You want to look at it. You want to look for yourself what it is. The first we see is that this is looking at associations. We can never say anything about association, right? We can never infer causation from these correlations, right? The second thing we're going to look at is the hazard ratios, right? So this is the relative risk. So these are fairly low. Remember, when we're looking at relative risk of less than about 0.8 or 0.8 or 0.75, in this kind of large observational cohort. So this is, again, food frequency questionnaires every 4 years. So you give someone a food frequency questionnaire and you infer what they've been eating for the past 4 years based on the results to that. That is known to be a terrible methodology. Okay, and then we look at some of this data. 0.4%, 11% here. These are all pretty meaningless, right? Even your trans fats showed up as healthy. So this is all based on modeling. So this is really bad data. Very strange. Listen, the short story is, as it says even in the conclusion, these findings are observational and warrant confirmation in intervention settings. In other words, there's nothing we can meaningfully deduce from this study. The hazard ratios are too small. The methodology is too flawed. It relies on food frequency questionnaires and then adjusts the data based on whatever the scientists thought we're looking for, right? So not helpful.
In 2025, a study in JAMA Internal Medicine showed that higher intake of plant fats was linked to significantly lower risks of both cardiovascular disease and overall mortality.
Okay, let's look at that one too. Okay, butter and plant-based oils and mortality, 2025. Design, looking at the Nurses' Health Study and Nurses' Health Study 2. And so this is all that big cohort of observational data that all the vegans like to rely on. The data sets, if you look at the time over which this was taken, they really rely on the healthy user bias. So this is a time when people were being told to eat low fat, when people were being told that fat and animal foods are unhealthy. And therefore, the ones that consume fewer of that were the ones who are taking better care of their health, or at least you can't control for that possibility, right? Nevertheless, let's look at what we've got here. Higher intakes of canola, soybean, and olive oil, and lower total mortality, 0.85. So again, we're not reaching that 0.8 threshold that we would like to say, or even 0.75 to actually say that there might be causation going on. That's olive oil, which is the best one. And then these, like, this is just noise, 0.94, 0.92, nothing there. Let me just see the hazard ratio for butter. Higher intake of butter was associated with higher cancer mortality. So again, HR is 1.12, so 12%. So again, in order to actually posit that something might be causative, we want to see a hazard ratio of at least 2.0. That's a doubling. Now, even if there's a doubling, it doesn't mean that it's causal. It just means that it's probably not noise. To give you some perspective, when we look at studies for smoking, you're looking at a hazard ratio of 8 to like 20, depending on the study, right? Or at least 6, right? So in other words, that's a 600% increase versus a 12%. And that's how we can begin to posit causality in the case of smoking. This is a 12% increase, okay? Meaning this, noise.
It's not opinion, that's science. But
yeah. What does that mean? It's not opinion in science. Listen, it's the opinion of scientists who are manipulating data based on really bad food frequency questionnaires, mining data that frankly, I mean, who was it? Johnny Ioannidis, who said, look, if you want to continue mining these nurses' health study for outcomes, like, it's just boring. You're just giving us statistical nonsense, and you're doing all kinds of adjustments so that you can claim it has some relevance, so that you can claim it's a statistically significant finding. Often they're not, right?
Saturated fat isn't the only problem. Let's talk about the hidden sodium bomb in your favorite dairy products.
Sodium, okay. Maybe that's why he mentioned cheese earlier.
Single slice of processed American cheese contains over 400 milligrams of sodium. That's more than a small bag of potato chips. Now, think about how much cheese goes into pizza.
So sodium is a complicated story, and I don't necessarily want to get into it here, but the WHO guidelines for sodium are extremely low. They're unrealistically low. And if you're interested in learning sort of what the optimal sodium intake, consider that I think it's South Korea that has some of the lowest rates of heart disease and consumes about 400% of the WHO guideline, if memory serves. It might be closer to 600%. Anyway, they consume a lot of salt, much more than, say, the US, which has much higher rates of heart disease, right? So we can find data indicating that whatever the current sodium recommendations are not optimal.
Or nachos or mac and cheese, that sodium skyrockets.
So that's interesting that when he's thinking dairy, he's thinking nachos and mac and cheese. Yeah, if you combine dairy with carbs, and now you might have a serious problem, right? Because you're activating that Randall cycle pathway. You're having high carb and high fat foods at the same time. And just the carbs on their own are going to cause heart disease, right? So if in this guy's mind, pizza and nachos and mac and cheese are the dairy foods, yeah, those should definitely be avoided. No question about that.
It's your blood pressure, forcing your heart to work harder with every single beat, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And the American Heart Association has been warning us for years.
So I would just challenge you, like, take your blood pressure, then have a glass of salt water and take your blood pressure again. See if it changes anything. For most of you, you'll probably find, I assume that many of you are not taking enough sodium, not taking enough electrolytes. Many of you will find that your blood pressure goes down a little, may go down significantly. Some of you may find that it goes up, but most of you, I would wager, would not.
Years. High sodium intake directly correlates with increased blood pressure.
So again, look at the. I mean, that's kind of true. It's kind of not true, right? So again, you can find the outliers. Yes, in places like the US where people are having their salt with these high carb foods, with French fries, or in desserts and packaged foods and potato chips. Yes, high sodium intake is an indicator that you're having a lot of processed foods. But in South Korea, as I mentioned before, when you're having a lot of salt, you're probably having a lot of kimchi. Kimchi is made with cabbage and peppers, and it's fermented. It doesn't have so much sugar. It does not correlate with high blood pressure. But notice how they worded that. They didn't say cause. They said correlate. So even they know that they can't claim causation for certain things, right?
Which is the leading cause of heart attacks and strokes. So
it's weird. I thought you just said saturated fat was the leading cause of heart attacks and strokes. Like, make up your mind, right? Neither of these are, to be clear.
What if everything you've been told about dairy being essential for health was actually just brilliant marketing? The Got Milk campaign.
So again, just because you can say that people are involved in marketing, and you can also say that the marketing is has a point, right? Those two positions are actually logically consistent. You can't just say because a company spends or an industry spends billions of dollars marketing its product, which all industries do, by the way, You can't say that because they do that, then suddenly you have to disbelieve everything that they say, right? You have to actually prove that there's something incorrect in what they're saying.
Wasn't created to improve your health. It was designed to boost declining milk sales. The dairy industry spends over
Let's say this is true. So what?
$100 million annually on advertising to convince you that their products are necessary. Meanwhile, the dietary guidelines for Americans still recommend 3 servings of dairy per day, despite mounting scientific evidence showing its cardiovascular risks.
Nonsense. Yeah, we'll get into the nonsense in a second. But I wasn't aware 3 servings of dairy per day. I'm not sure that maybe he's right, but that would be interesting to me. I thought there's, the new guidelines basically have been extremely low fat, anti dairy. Maybe they say low fat dairy. That's possible. They like their skim milk yogurt and stuff.
Why? Well, this is at least in part due to the dairy industry funding the research studies that are flawed and designed.
Every industry, including your oat milk industry or whatever, they fund the studies on their own products, right? That is a problem. I agree that's a problem. It's not a problem that's unique to dairy.
So that dairy has the favorable outcome. Why? Because they can afford to, and it twists the narrative to make them look like healthy options. So think of your heart as an expensive sports car. Would you deliberately pour sand in the gas tank? Of course.
Listen, if you want to make the sports car analogy, what is the fuel that humans have been using for 12,000 years? What is a fuel that at least some humans have been using for 12,000 years to fuel the gas tank? It is dairy. What are fuels that humans have not been using for 12,000 years? Soy milk, oat milk, these kind of things, right? So if you want to be safe, you can't conclude that dairy is the sand. You have to actually be logically cautious and say that dairy appears to be safe as far as we can tell. For most people in most circumstances, everything needs a caveat, but that these new things, these highly industrialized, laden with seed oil, potentially toxic, anti-nutrient filled, phytate and lectin and tannin filled plant milks, those are probably not safe. That seems to me to be, for most people, that seems to me to be a fair conclusion here.
Of course not. Yet that's essentially what you're doing when you load your body with dairy products day after day after day. The longer you wait to make changes, the harder it becomes to reverse the damage. So here's the good news. You don't have to sacrifice flavor or nutrition when ditching dairy. In fact, you'll be upgrading.
I would agree with that. I mean, listen, I have clients, as I've said, who can't tolerate dairy for any number of reasons, and doesn't matter very much, to be perfectly honest.
Your heart health with these alternatives. Oat milk, for instance, contains beta glucans that actively lower your cholesterol.
So why would we care about actively lowering the cholesterol? Like, why would that be a thing? If our body, do we trust our body, or do we trust the oat milk industry? Oat milk is also laden with phytates, lectins, I don't know what else, man. And when you look at the ingredients, if you see something with expeller pressed canola oil or whatever it is, rapeseed oil or soybean oil, like, please avoid that stuff. I to be perfectly honest, I was addicted to soy milk for years. It's how I quit smoking. The first time I tried to quit smoking was with guzzling soy milk that was laden with canola oil, and it did nothing for my health. It gave me really bad asthma, all kinds of other problems, right?
Soy milk provides heart protective isoflavones, cashew-based.
So all of these things, like, he's pointing to the positive nutrients, which are there, but there are also anti-nutrients in there. So again, soy is going to have lectins. Cashew has, man, I don't know what are in cashews, but it's not going to be great. The thing to remember about all these foods is, yes, humans have been eating them, but we've been eating them in a certain context. Oats were actually designed as food for horses, so let's leave oats aside. But soy was inedible until, I forget which dynasty it was in China. I'm going to write a paper about this soon. Until a certain Chinese dynasty learned that you could ferment them and turn it into, what is today tempeh and tofu and so on. And when it was done as a condiment. It was done in, like, you eat these little portions with pork. I mean, even today, one of the best known dishes of tofu is called mapo tofu, which is essentially a pork dish with a little bit of tofu. Torque, that's funny. It's essentially a pork dish with a little bit of tofu, right?
Diseases offer the creaminess without the arterial damage. And hemp milk has an amino acid that may reduce risk of heart disease.
So it may not, right? This is all conjecture and dangerous conjecture, because you're telling people to eat these foods that may reduce risks of some things, but definitely contain toxic chemicals, phytochemicals, 100% sure. And you're telling them that those plants are safe to consume, not even in moderation. Like, there's no caveat here. There's no, like, okay, you can have it, but keep your dosage less than, 100 grams a week or whatever the dosage should be. I don't know. But yeah, these are very dangerous statements, and they've hurt a lot of vegan friends. So I don't really appreciate this.
Almond-based cream cheese spreads with 0 trans fats. Your heart beats 100,000 times per day, pumping 2,000 gallons of blood throughout your entire body. It never takes a break. So don't you think it deserves better than dairy? I mean, look, I get it. Change isn't easy, especially when it comes to your food choices, but your heart is working tirelessly.
Okay, this is getting silly. Let me just bring up a couple things. So when we're talking about the nutritional epidemiological studies, I keep bringing back this one article from 2023. It was an Atlantic article. I've written a blog post about this too. You can check out my blog if you want my analysis of this. But this was super interesting because you look at this and you find out that in all of this epidemiological studies, including the Nurses' Health Study, including the NHANES data, the 2 data sources that have been referred to in this Joker's video, you find that ice cream is a health food. Ice cream has a pretty big effect size. And, he gets this tip, this particular journalist, he or she, haha, the ice cream thing won't go away. That's pretty funny, right? Now, ice cream is a combination of the highest, maybe it's the food highest in saturated fat, but it's also high in sugar. So according to me and according to everyone else, this shouldn't be there, right? And if you see it there and it's a pretty big effect size, it calls into doubt all of the other effect sizes, number one. Or number two, maybe it is something weird. Maybe it's saturated fat is actually protecting against the mechanisms whereby sugar damages the arteries. That's another possibility, right? That's the first study I wanted to show you. There's another study I wanted to show you here. This study is super interesting. So Sweden 2021, what this did was it didn't use the food frequency questionnaire. It used a secondary marker, right? So it's one way to measure how much dairy a person is drinking or eating or whatever is to have someone follow them around and with a diary or to bring them into a lab. When you do these kind of interventions, the cost becomes insane. You're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars to do a study. It's not going to work. But there's another way, which is that if there's a marker, if there's a specific acid, this is a fatty acid called pentadecanoic acid. There's recently been a lot of fuss about this because it's thought to be a new super nutrient. People are selling it as a supplement, right? But it's pretty much only found in dairy or only found in significant amounts in dairy. So you can measure, this in the serum cholesterol esters. You can see how much 15O or pentadecanoic acid is in there, and you can have a pretty good guess within. Obviously, there's a margin of error, but you can pretty much know how much dairy that person is eating. And based on this, we find that the people who are eating more dairy had less heart disease, had less all-cause mortality, et cetera, et cetera. Higher levels of 15O and 17O were associated with lower cardiovascular risk, right? Now, again, this one and other ones will need further backing up. But again, my point about negative evidence holds. If you're trying to advance a hypothesis, you want to look at the evidence that could potentially disprove it, right? These are not huge associations, 0.88, 0.86. But again, it's in the wrong direction. It's showing you that dairy might actually be healthy. Then there's this one. This is another meta-analysis. This is again using NHANES, the same sources as the previous data. But if you cut the data a different way, if you do a different analysis, these numbers are so close together that you find in this analysis, dairy is protective, right? Not significantly protective, and it is slightly unprotective or whatever. It has a slightly higher risk is the wrong word, slightly higher association with cardiovascular mortality, but all-cause mortality went down, right? Higher total dairy consumption was associated with lower total and cerebrovascular mortality, that's strokes, right? While higher milk consumption specifically was associated with a higher risk of cardiovascular disease. Okay, so these are some food for thought. What's my final thoughts on this one? I'm not sure that I have many final thoughts. It's just that, if someone asks me, is dairy a healthy part of a human diet or not? I honestly don't have the best answer, to be perfectly honest, because for me, dairy is a new food. It's 12,000 years old-ish, no, less old than that. I think the best data shows it may be 7,000 or 8,000 years old. So it's entered the human food supply fairly late. As I mentioned at the start of this video, it's entered the food supply in order to compensate for the fact that we no longer have access to our traditional prey species, which were higher in fat. So if someone says, is dairy healthy or not, I don't really have the best answer. Someone asked me this at a talk on Friday, and I gave a bit of waffle. I don't have the best answer, but I can tell you pretty categorically that there's no evidence to show that it's unhealthy for most people, right? So for most people, it seems to be a pretty safe intervention. And there's certainly some societies which are very dairy dependent. So you look at the Maasai in Kenya, who eat only milk and blood for a certain period of their life. And then you look at Mongolia, which eats a lot of dairy and seems to be protected from that, from certain things. They also smoke a lot. And despite the fact that they smoke a lot, the dairy seems to have a protective effect in that particular population. From that, do we conclude that it's helpful for everyone? No. But I'm just saying that the hypothesis that dairy is unhealthy seems to be pretty easy to disprove looking at different data sets, including the epidemiological data sets, to be honest. Because if it was unhealthy, you would see a much bigger effect size, even in the epidemiology. And when we do things like we look at blood markers and so on, or we do different kinds of epidemiological studies, we see that it actually, the association goes the other way. There's a small association, but it's an association with better health outcomes. So, end of the story. If you want to drink your milk, drink your milk. If you want to eat your cheese, eat your cheese. If you don't. Like, there's no force. No one's forcing anyone to do anything. But I have a problem when people claim foods are unhealthy that are the data doesn't let us conclude that. Okay? Thanks so much, and I'll see you in the next one.